Romanesque art, 11th and 12th century. Romanesque is a name that was coined in the 19th century to describe the pre-Gothic art style of the 11th and 12th centuries. Now, it was named Romanesque simply because it reminded people of Roman architecture, because it had stone vaults, rounded arches, very massive architecture, but it really is not Roman. It is not classical architecture. It is not antique Roman architecture. So don't be fooled by the name. The masons do not use concrete rubble construction. They don't use concrete, I think, until the 19th century. The Romans used it, and then modern era. They do not use the classical architectural orders of Doric, Ionic, Corinthian, composite. The sculpture is usually very abstract. You may have tubular figures, tubular arms and legs, and the proportions can be stretched any which way just to fit the space available in the architecture. So you essentially have very non-illusionistic or very non-classical sense of the figure and of decorating your buildings. There are a few exceptions, but generally you'll find more abstract art, something that's almost the opposite of the classical illusionist. One of the characteristics of Romanesque art is that there are regional styles or regional characteristics. And this is because there are regional rulers. We don't have the Carolingian emperors ruling vast tracts of territory. Certainly we had the Ottonian emperors. The last Ottonian emperor died in 1024. And another dynasty inherited the throne as the king of the Germans, and they eventually take on the title of Holy Roman Emperor. But even that's fairly restricted. It's pretty much Germany and some of Italy, and parts of it break up too. And even in areas that have a king, you also have a lot of other rulers. You have barons or dukes or margraves, or whatever the titles are, who are ruling their principalities, even though they sometimes answer to a king. They actually are very jealous of their authority and don't want to be told what to do. After the disintegration of the Carolingian Empire, individual principalities were the norm. Only rarely, for example, the Ottonian Empire, were large parts of Europe ruled by a single monarch. The economic system was feudalism, based on a hierarchical class system of lords, who are these powerful, they can be kings, dukes, barons, whatever, and vassals, who are other lords, owe fealty or loyalty to these lords. Now, basically, the idea is you give me something and I'll give you something. You give me land, and I'll send warriors when you need somebody to fight. The warrior class owns the land, and the warrior class rules and fights. They do that a lot. Who does the work? The serfs. The serfs are the peasants. They work the land. They do the manual labor. Technically, they are not slaves because they can't be sold away from the land, but they really have no rights. So they have very, very poor conditions of living. Now, the idea was that God had established a hierarchy in heaven, and there was also a hierarchy on earth. And they had the idea that heaven, the idea of hierarchy was very important in the Middle Ages. Heaven was a celestial hierarchy with God at the apex, different orders of angels below, finally men, who are a little lower than the angels. The church is another hierarchy. In the West, the Pope, the Bishop of Rome, had finally gained the authority as the preeminent head of the Western Latin Church. And conflict. During the Romanesque period, there was a great conflict between kings and popes, or the emperor and the popes. And particularly this was based on who is going to pick candidates, or who is going to name the bishops, or name the people to ecclesiastical or church offices. Traditionally, the rulers had named the bishops. The emperor had named the pope. And during the 11th century, that begins to change. There is a huge controversy called the investiture controversy. Who can invest bishops? And sometimes the emperors are appointing popes, and the cardinals are appointing popes. This is when the College of Cardinals grows up as well. They have to have somebody who will elect the pope. I don't think we'll be doing too much discussion of that in this class, but that's a little background for you. So conflict arose between the king, or the emperor, and the pope as to whose authority should hold sway, both claiming to be divinely appointed for their office, both claiming that they are the regents or the vicar of God on earth. Now, monasticism is very important. This is the period of the growth of monastic orders. The Carolingians, Charlemagne, Louis the Pious founded many monasteries. They're growing. There's others being founded. You're even having new monastic orders coming into being, although I think even more perhaps in the Gothic period. And they're founding monasteries. There's building campaigns to expand existing ones and to found new ones. Generally, when we think of Romanesque churches, most of those Romanesque churches seem to be abbey or monastery churches. Monasticism is a powerful institution, or was a powerful institution. Essentially, it's a community of people who have taken religious vows, and these vows are poverty, chastity, obedience. They live in common. They don't own individual property, although later on that breaks up a bit. You might have your own prayer book or your own rosary. Of course, the rosaries come in much later, but your own little cross or something like that. But you're not supposed to at first, anyway. In the West, most of the monks are following the rule of St. Benedict and the Liturgy of the 8 Canticle Hours, or the Divine Office. What that means is that 8 times during the day and night, the monks and the nuns stop what they're doing, or if they're asleep, get out of bed and go to the church, and they have essentially a short service where they recite the Divine Office, which are prayers, responsive readings, the Psalms. During one of them, of course, there would be a Mass said every day, but not everyone is not a complete hour-long service that we think of today in many of our churches. They take place about every 3 hours, essentially. Some of the names are still with us. Vesper services. Lots of churches have Vesper services. Those are sunset services. Now, the monks are supposed to devote their lives to work and prayer in obedience to their vows, obedience to the rule of the order, and obedience to their superiors in the church. And their direct superior, of course, would be the prior or the abbot, who rules the monastery. And then, of course, you would have higher-up people in the church, too. Top-ranking monks did not always stay in the cloister. They didn't always stay in the monastery. They had a lot of contact with the outside world. Some of these abbots were advisors to kings, and In fact, sometimes they started out as, well, think of Bishop Bernvard in the Ottonian period. He was the tutor to Otto III, and then he was appointed bishop. You can't have it the other way around, too, where the bishop can become the advisor, or the abbot can become an advisor. Monasteries can serve as pilgrimage sites if they have very important relics. And many of them have guest houses, and these essentially are the inns where people would stay when they're traveling. Some of them have schools, first to train the novices, and then eventually some of the nobility would send their sons and daughters to be taught in monastic schools, or convent schools in the case of girls. We mentioned before the infirmaries. You start having an infirmary for the monks, and as a town grows up around it, people might even come and ask for help when they needed it. So some of these things serve the secular world as well as the religious communities. Now, essentially, most monasteries start out being away from other people, sort of in a remote location, going into the wilderness to separate themselves from the world. But as it would happen in many cases, the world follows them. Towns grow up around monasteries, and you'll find some that are still out in the remote locations, but others become a town or a city. And in those cases, obviously, they're going to have more interaction with the locals. Donations of land and serfs, plus other gifts, caused many of the monasteries to become self-sufficient, which all monasteries are supposed to be self-sufficient. Remember that from the plan of St. Gall, the idea that your monks and their serfs and the lay brothers are supposed to be able to raise everything you need. So you have an ideal of a self-sufficient monastery. I don't know if they always were. Probably not. But as more people would donate land to the monasteries, and when you donate land, you're donating the serfs to work it with you. They come too. Other gifts are given to the monasteries, so some of these monasteries become extremely wealthy. Now, how does that tie in with your vows of poverty? Well, the vow of poverty is against individual ownership. So the individual monks don't own the land, but the community, the monastery, owns it, but they do not have individual ownership. As a practical matter, they enjoyed the fruits of it, and the abbots particularly administered this. And of course, some monasteries were able to be charitable to the poor of their community, the outside the secular world. Others perhaps not. Nuns took similar vows, but were much more strictly cloistered. They were not supposed to be wandering around. Often the female orders were poorer. People would rather donate to a male order. And they were, as we said, more strictly cloistered. Some of the poorest ones were completely dependent on donations for the very food they ate, and sometimes they went hungry. But other times, of course, let's say you're a wealthy, a wealthy landowning family, and you send your youngest daughter off to be a nun in the monastery. Well, you may very well want to provide a greater donation than simply the dowry. And nuns did have dowries. Just as you are getting married to somebody, to a secular lord, you are the bride of Christ, you have to bring a dowry. Not everybody was bad off or very wealthy. There's a whole range. And at different times also, a monastery might start poor and become wealthy later. Both male and female convents had scriptorium. in which manuscripts were copied, and both male and female religious might illuminate manuscripts, which we've already seen. Starts in the 11th century. Right at the beginning of the 11th century is when we saw Romanesque art. We see Romanesque art beginning. And that is the year 1000, the year of the millennium. Now, just remember right before the year 2000, there were people who were saying the end of the world is coming, it's going to happen in the year 2000. Well, even more so in the year 1000. People really believed that the end of the world would soon occur, that the apocalypse was upon them, that the last judgment would come, and the year passed, and the world was still there. And I have a quotation here from Raul Glauber, who was a Cluniac monk, and he's writing about 1003. And he says, "Therefore, after the year of the millennium, which is now about 3 years past, there occurred throughout the world, especially in Italy and Gaul, a rebuilding of church basilicas. It was as if the whole earth, having cast off the old by shaking itself, were clothing itself everywhere in the white robe of the church." And so we think that, yeah, they were so happy that the world didn't end that they start building churches, and thanks to God. Some of the characteristics that we see in Romanesque churches are masonry vaults with rounded arches. There are a few exceptions, but by and large, most of them have masonry vaults, rounded arches, tunnel or barrel vaults, groin or cross vaults. Okay, either one. Rounded arches, and once again, sometimes there are some exceptions. In Burgundy, they start doing pointed arches, but we'll talk about that later. So most of these churches have rounded arches. They have very thick masonry walls, often with very small windows. And there is what we call the articulation of parts, or you could also think of it as kind of a visual separation of parts. When you articulate something, you say it very clearly and distinctly. When you can see these distinct parts, we call it an articulation of parts, and we'll see that as we look at these. We said the walls are often very, very thick to support those heavy masonry vaults. And here you're seeing some diagrams. If you look at the first two examples, you're seeing rounded arches, what we call a tunnel vault. A tunnel vault is simply if you take a round arch and you would extend it, you'd make it longer, you have a tunnel vault, or a barrel vault. It looks like a barrel. And you could have one that's just simply does not have anything going across it, but very frequently, you see in the center example here, St. Sernin and Toulouse, you have transverse arches, or arches that go across the ceiling, across the vault. We'll show you some of those. Something else you occasionally have, usually in the side aisles, but sometimes they do experiment with it, as in Santa Madeleine in Vézelay. They do experiment with it in the nave, is a groin or a cross vault. And here we're going to see some diagrams. If you look down to the diagram where it says A, B, C, the first one is your barrel vault, or your tunnel vault, and B and C are the groin vault, or the cross vault. And what they are is you took a barrel vault and you crossed it at right angles, you have a groin vault. And so you can see B is as if you were looking down at it, you were in the ceiling or someplace, and C is if you're looking up, so they look like sort of concave triangles. The diagram with the arrows on it is showing you, they're saying, the thrust, or the way the weight is distributed in a rounded arch or rounded vault, a tunnel vault. And you can see that the vault itself, the front, the arch, is made up of these wedge-shaped blocks. The one in the middle is called a keystone, and the others are called either archivolts or voussoirs. But essentially, because they're wedge-shaped, they kind of lean on each other and sort of distribute the weight to each other. And then, as you go out, you see these arrows going out. The thrust, or the weight, is going out, and you need to have very, very thick walls to support this. If your walls are too thin, the whole thing will collapse. So you need to have very thick walls. Sometimes they'll even add, as we'll see, buttresses. The other drawing here is showing you the method of construction. So you're going to put up one of these groin vaults. You use a method called centering, which essentially is a wooden framework is made. The masonry is placed over it. And then when that dries, they can take the wooden framework down and move it to the next section or the next bay. And you can also see that they're building a roof, a gabled roof, above this vaulting. So it's kind of like if you have an attic area above your ceiling. Here you're looking at a cross section. Now, every Romanesque church does not have the same cross section or the same elevation. We'll see variations, but this serves as a good generic example. So you've got your masonry vault. Why? Why go to all that trouble? Why go to all that work? Well, there's, of course, different reasons. One of the reasons we think is probably fire safety. Wooden roof in a building where you have candles burning all the time is a fire hazard. So it takes a lot more to burn stone and crack, of course, in high heats. And you do have churches that burn down. But it's less likely to burn down if you have a masonry vault than if you have a timber or wooden ceiling. So that's one possibility, fire safety. The other is the acoustics. This is the period of the Gregorian chant, a plain song, a chant that is unaccompanied by musical instruments. And the monks are chanting, and the sound is reverberating off the masonry vault. Another reason is probably it looked good. They probably developed it. These masons came up with a new idea, something they thought would be really good. And they continued to do it, and they continued to experiment with it, and they continued to develop it because people found it pleasing. Now, here we're looking at a kind of cross-section, and we're also looking into the nave, so you can see this kind of cutaway view. And we're talking again about that articulation or separation of parts. If you look at the diagram and you look into the nave, you can see that there's a colonnette or a shaft that rises from the floor, goes up to the springing of the vault, and then you have a transverse arch that crosses over and comes down the other side. And when you look at the wall, it looks like there's a vertical shaft that's dividing the wall into sections. And you've already seen, and you can imagine, we'll see some more examples, if you look at the ceiling, you're going to see these transverse arches going across, and they're going to divide up the ceiling. So essentially we're starting to have sections of the church, which we call bays. Clearly articulated, clearly separated. You can also see some horizontal sections. You can see that there's a horizontal molding that's going across, that dividing the nave arcade on the floor from the second story, or the gallery level. A gallery essentially is a second story, and it's large enough that people can walk around and stand up there. The walls to support that heavy vault have to be very thick, and if you look at the outside of this building, you can see that there are pilasters or buttresses. Now we call them buttresses. They're really thicker than pilasters, and they help support the building. And sometimes the buttresses can be quite thick. They also here are giving some visual interest to the exterior, and projecting outward, dividing it up into sections, giving some vertical elements. I wanted to tell you what a Lombard corbel table was. You'll probably hear the term or read the term. And basically, if you look at this diagram, you look at the drawing, you see at the top a series of arches, which are underneath a cornice or a molding. And their decoration, they add a little thickness to the wall there, but primarily they're decorative. And that's what they call a Lombard corbel table. One of the other characteristics that we find in this first Romanesque, these very early Romanesque churches, is that the masons are often using fairly small split stones rather than giant blocks. You'll get great blocks later. You'll get all sorts of masonry types. But here, for the first examples, you're going to see some of the smaller stones. So now you know what a Lombard corbel table. The first example that we're going to look at of a Romanesque church is a very, very early example. As you can see, the date is 1001 to 1026. So this is founded right after the millennium. So the end of the world did not occur, and they're building this monastery. If you look at the picture, you will see that this looks like it's really in a remote location. It is. It's in the French Pyrenees. It's right up on the mountaintop. And, of course, most of the monasteries were founded out in a remote location. What happened, of course, is in some cases towns grew up around them, and I suspect that the reason that this monastery has survived so long and that we still have this very, very early Romanesque architecture is just because it is so remote. That it wasn't remodeled in a more modern style, that warriors didn't come and tear it down or burn it, or the land get used for something else in later, more modern times, or, as I say, rebuilt into, say, a Gothic structure. It's rather remote out there in the Pyrenees. Now, there's two stories in the church. And we're looking at the top story, which is I guess the main story. The crypt is below it. And I don't have any pictures of that, unfortunately. But when you look at this, you'll see the masonry. There's two stories. The crypt is below. And what we're looking at is the second story, but it's really the church proper, as it were. You can see that it's made out of masonry, small stones. And if you look at the plan, you'll see that essentially you have three tunnel vaulted aisles. The one in the center, the nave, is no larger, it's no wider than the ones at the side. The church itself, what is supporting this arcade and supporting this vault, you have columns, very simple columns, and you have a sort of a pair of columns and two pair of columns on either side of the center aisle or the nave, and then there is large, heavy piers. And that's because it's most vulnerable to collapse in the center. So to make sure that it will stay up, it's a very early example. They're just starting to vault. Want some extra security. They put very, very heavy piers in the middle, and then they have a pair of columns, and then you're down to the apse end of the church. And as you can see, it's a triple apse with the one in the center being a little larger, projecting outward a little bit. When you look at this, you're going to see a transverse arch. You can see that pier that we were talking about. And attached to that pier is extra masonry, a shaft, or a pilaster, or just think of just an extra layer of masonry. And it rises up to the springing of the vault. That's where the vault starts to curve. And then you have a transverse arch that goes across. It's just this masonry just continues across. and then of course comes down the other side. Something else that is very true of this building is that it's very, very dark inside. You're going to have very small windows at either end. They don't have any windows on the sides, so it's going to be very dark. Basically, you would have had candlelight. Remember, they get up at night to say the divine office. So even during the day, it would be very, very dark. And so candles is what you would be using for your light source. In this particular picture, they now have electric light bulbs, so the apse is more brightly illuminated. It probably would have been more brightly illuminated because they would have had probably left some candles there, but it still would have been very dark. I should also mention that it's quite possible that the masonry didn't show that it was plastered. I don't know about this particular church, but we're going to see some examples where it's the plaster still survives. Here you can see a close-up of one of the columns and a very good view of those small split stones that make up the architecture of the building. If you look beyond the columns, you can see a little detail of the transverse arch, both in the center aisle and on one of the side aisles. It seems to be a little lower. Our second example of the first Romanesque, or this very early Romanesque style, is a little bit later. It's in Cardona, in Spain, San Vicente de Cardona. And I believe it was a castle chapel. I think that's true. As you can see, it's begun just a few years after they finished St. Martin's. This one in 1029 to 40. And we're looking at the exterior of this. And you can see a really clear separation of parts. The building looks like it's made up of different geometric forms. You see the cylinder of the apse, and then a cylinder of a smaller apse coming out of a smaller chapel coming out of the transept. The transept looks like, sort of a oblong, square, cubic shape with a gable on top. You can see the crossing tower, which is a polygonal shape. So when we're talking about the separation or the articulation of parts, it means that you can look at this, you can really see it, you can draw the plan from this. You also see those Lombard corbel tables. In this case, you've got 2 arches, and then a long buttress or shaft or pilaster that comes down and is really pretty decorative. It probably also gives a little extra support. But basically it's giving you some articulation of the surface of the exterior, some vertical elements. And here you see details, and a little closer in, corbel table, the pilaster. And here we are inside. What you have is a tunnel vault with transverse arches. And once again, they call these either transverse arches or diaphragm arches because they support like the diaphragm in the body, or transverse because they're going from one side to the other. You can see that you have a pilaster that comes up the very heavy pier, and the transverse arch continues that across the vault, and of course then you have your pilaster going down the other side. When you have these repeated, you're starting to divide the nave into bays, into sections. And you're going to look at the wall and you say, okay, here's the section, here's division. Here's that pilaster, or later on colonnettes. It also makes the pier more interesting because you have this extra bit of masonry that sticks out a little bit. And, it's just physically more interesting, more decorative, and probably adds more support to that very heavy pier. And it kind of breaks up the pier, so it's not just this one monolithic shape. If you look up, you're seeing what was in that octagonal tower is a dome. It's a dome on squinches. You may remember we had squinches for San Vitale, and essentially squinches are not as elegant as pendentives. Essentially, you put some masonry sort of like across the corners, and then rest your dome on the squinches. So we've already mentioned the carticulated or compound piers, where you have the extra masonry, the shaft or the pilaster that is on the pier. It adds visual interest, dimension, you might call it. It helps to divide the church into sections or bays or parts. And when we say clearly articulated, you have this little separate section that's very crisp and clear, and you could. Now, I promised you some plaster. This plaster has paintings on it. This is in another, or was in another Spanish church. It's now in a museum. It's at Tahoe, the church of Sant Climent, and it is a fresco in the apse. Fresco is when you're painting on wet plaster. Essentially, first you have your masonry, which is rough. You put on a layer of rough plaster. You probably do your drawing on that. And then you put in wet plaster, whatever section you can do in a day. You don't do the whole wall. You do a section. And then the artist would take the pigments, which they may be ground up and mixed with water, and paint directly on this wet plaster. The plaster then would soak up the pigment. And as it dries, you have essentially colored plaster, a thin layer of colored plaster. And sometimes they'll survive for quite a long time. It is quite possible that these churches were stuccoed, plastered, and whitewashed on the outside, maybe even painted colors. But not, I don't think very much, if any, of the exterior plaster would survive. I read somewhere that stucco lasts about 200 years on the outside, so you're probably not going to find any. But occasionally inside we'd still have our wall paintings on the plaster. We can look here at the style. I use the words excuse me, I use the words iconic, like an image, you would never mistake this for a real human being, would you? Very, very frontal. In other words, he rigidly looks out at you. There's no twist to the body. Very heavy outlines, very linear, and the draperies have stylized patterns. They're rather wondrous patterns. Lots of fun, and I do think that it's very important that when you're looking at Romanesque art, whether it's carvings, whether it's paintings, that you do pay attention to the drapery style. This is one of the characteristics. The different artists have their own, I guess you say, quirks, their own handwriting in how they portray draperies, their own patterns. Sometimes they're almost like plaques or overlapping plates. And when I'm looking at the torso, that's what I'm reminded of, a particular style of carving, actually. Sometimes they're in little ridges. Sometimes they're just grooves. But pay attention to draperies. The images are stylized. And we are often fond of saying that when something is more abstracted, it can refer to a spiritual realm, because if you have painting or sculpture that imitates the physical material world, that's what it's doing. But here you have art that is, you recognize the figures, but certainly would never expect this person to be walking around. They're not interested in the physical anatomy. They're interested in creating a spiritual reality, if you will. Something that is immaterial, that is supernatural, that has power and strength in the image. And sometimes, of course, you have narrative scenes, which are teaching people stories, teaching them something. In this case, what we're looking at, of course, is the apse of a church. It curves back. I think that's why Christ is looking thinner here in this picture than in the other one. But And you see that you have Christ in majesty, or Christ in glory, or the majesty of the Lord, or Christ in heaven. Sometimes students get really concerned about titles. Different books, of course, may use different titles. You may find one textbook that calls it Christ in Majesty, another one may call it the Majestas Domini, using the Latin, the Majesty of the Lord, or Christ in Glory. Basically, you don't really have titles as such, something you have to call things, until you get to a period in which artists are naming their works of art and they're exhibiting in them, and they have little placards that tell you what they're called. And this is really, they have 19th century and 18th century art exhibits. So that's long in the future. What do we call these things for the title or the subject? It's whatever the subject is. The title is the subject. And sometimes you have a variety of terms, Christ in glory, Christ in majesty, that mean essentially very similar things. Christ enthroned in heaven, seated on the rainbow. That's what's going on here. So we have Christ seated on this ark, which is presumably the rainbow. He is surrounded by a mandorla. Mandorla is just from the Latin word for almond, and it is an almond-shaped halo that surrounds the entire body. You can see the nimmed halo, or the halo with a cross, around Christ's head, and then around his entire body is this mandorla. At his feet is a big circle, which of course is the globe of the earth, or the universe, which the earth is his footstool, as the psalmist says. Christ is blessing, the two fingers raised with the other fingers curved down. He could be making the sign of the cross with that. And as you can see, in the other hand, he's holding an open book, presumably a Bible. And you can possibly make out some of the words. And on the first page it says, Ego Lux. Ego, looks like. Ego Lux. Ego Lux. And that means, I am light, or I am the light of the world. So this is Christ, the heavenly Christ, as the light of the world. You see over his shoulder, inscribed in what looks like the sky, the Alpha and the Omega, the two Greek letters that are at the beginning and the end of the Greek alphabet. And Christ is the Alpha and the Omega. I am the beginning and the end, this timeless being. He's shown as a divine ruler with authority over all the world. You have angels surrounding him, and you can also see, I don't think we see all of them, but you can see some of, yes you can see all of them, the evangelist symbols. On the far left, will be Christ's right, in that band of blue, you see a roundel, or a round image, that is the lion of St. Mark, the angel of Matthew, and it's a little hard to make out. I think that figure has an eagle with it, but I'm not positive, in which case it would be John. But then it looks like, you can see the horned animal with wings is probably the ox of St. Luke. So these are the creatures that in the book of Revelation, the book of Ezekiel, surround the throne of God, and they sing, Sanctus, 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 Holy, Holy, Holy. And in medieval exegesis, or medieval commentaries, they came to be symbolic of the four evangelists, or the four writers of the Gospels. So we see Christ as a divine ruler with authority over all the universe.